There's a way to raise your student financial confidence level by 56%. Intuit for Education offers free personal and professional financial education with real-world tools that empower students to achieve long-term success. Learn more at intuit.com/highered. This is College Matters from The Chronicle.
So at this point, literally every college leader in the country is facing the Obama test. Do you seek favor with Trump, or do you stick to your guns?
A strong call to action for college leaders came from an unlikely messenger this week, Barack Obama. Appearing on the final episode of Marc Maron's WTF podcast, the former U.S. president urged university leaders to show some backbone in the face of President Trump's attacks on the sector. Colleges targeted by the Trump administration may lose some federal money if they refuse to cut deals, Obama told Maron, but they ought not bargain with their autonomy just to end the pain. Instead, Obama advised, college leaders should be saying, quote, "Let's see if we can ride this out, because what we're not going to do is compromise our basic academic independence." Today, I'm joined by my colleague Andy Thomason, Assistant Managing Editor of the Chronicle of Higher Education, to dig into Obama's directive. Andy, welcome to College Matters.
Thanks for having me, Jack. It's an honor to be here.
Well, I appreciate it. Andy, you're my former editor, and I'm used to you asking me tough questions about the news, but today I'm going to turn the tables on you.
I've been preparing, Jack, and it's a little unsettling, but I'm ready to go.
All right. So this was a short but meaningful statement from the former president. What do you make of it?
Well, Jack, I think it's fascinating. Barack Obama is giving voice to what's probably been the single biggest story in higher education this year, and that is colleges being faced with this impossible choice. You have a federal government led by President Trump who's saying, reform our way, or you might lose your access to federal funds. And on the other side, you've got your own campus and advocates of higher education who are saying, no, don't sign away our independence. How could you push us down this slippery slope? What Barack Obama is doing is he's telling college leaders which side to pick. And he's also saying the sacrifice and the pain you might feel in doing this, that's a sign you're doing the right thing.
So what do you make of the timing of this?
Well, that might be the most fascinating part of all. Obama has put this challenge to college leaders at a time when they're all, to some degree, facing a real and unprecedented test. Just this month, the Trump administration invited 9 research universities to sign what it's calling a compact. It's about a 10-page long document that essentially asks universities to commit to planks of the administration's higher ed agenda. And in exchange, they're being told they can expect some kind of favorable treatment in terms of access to federal research funds. Now, a lot of college presidents might like the idea of striking a deal like that. But many people who have reviewed this compact are saying, whoa, this is way too intrusive. How could you agree to this? It gives Washington way too much power over universities. And now it's not just the 9 universities, the 9 recipients considering this thing. The administration has said anyone can sign it. So at this point, literally every college leader in the country is facing the Obama test. Do you seek favor with Trump, or do you stick to your guns?
Yeah, I think you're right about the timing of this. The fact that it happened this week when the compact is asking colleges to make all sorts of commitments to Trump around admissions and hiring and discipline, that feels significant to me. We're seeing different responses to the compact. This week, Brown said they wouldn't sign on to the compact. They cited concerns about academic freedom. But I want to talk about MIT because they were really the first out of the gate to say, we can't support this. And I want to drill down into something very shrewd that I think Sally Kornbluth, MIT's president, said. She issued a statement saying, this compact is essentially anti-merit. And it's suggesting that the Trump administration's political allies, not necessarily top scientists, will get preferential treatment under this deal. Part of what the Trump administration is saying, if you sign on to this, is that you'll get an advantage to federal funding if you're one of our friends. And Kornbluth is saying, no, that's not the way the system of merit really works. What do you make of that, Andy?
Well, I agree with you, Jack. It is shrewd. It's very sharp. And the reason that it's particularly sharp is that it turns the tables on Trump. The Trump administration and its rhetoric about higher ed has been awash with this feeling that higher ed needs to return to merit. It needs to turn to rigor. It needs to turn away from this woke nonsense to a spirit of merit and practice. And one example of that is that in the proposed compact, they are calling on colleges to ditch DEI practices in favor of, restoring merit in admissions. But colleges are engaged in another competition, which is for grant funding, and that's a competitive process. And the Trump administration's proposal to give preference to colleges for grant funding is asking them to abandon that competitive enterprise of applying for grant funding.
Join the club and we'll take care of you, seems to be kind of the message.
Exactly. And so MIT has recognized that paradox and called it out and used that as a rationale to reject the deal. And it's hard to dispute that on the merits. And one other thing here is that you cannot accuse MIT of being soft on merit. I mean, their whole cultural footprint is to be like the hardest of the hard science institutions, right? That's their reputation. And it's a reputation that in recent years they've reinforced through a couple of interesting moves. One is that, after there was this trend in higher ed of going test optional, MIT was one of the first to bring back standardized tests because they said, it's just too good a predictor of how students do in our very hardcore math instruction. And so because we're about rigor and we're about merit, we're going to bring them back. They also don't consider legacy and admissions. And so it's very hard to accuse them of being soft on merit.
Right. They're not the poster child for the problems the Trump administration seems to see in higher ed. This is where you go to build the Iron Man suit, not to get a handout, right?
Exactly.
So I'm curious whether you think, going back to Barack Obama's statement, that college leaders ought to step up, say, we're drawing a hard line around academic freedom and independence. Do you think MIT has passed the Obama test with this statement?
Certainly, they've passed the Obama test. They have said we're not going to compromise our academic independence. But the other half of that is more complicated because what the former president said is that this might bring you financial hardship, and you need to act to preserve your autonomy. MIT is not currently under threat of, losing hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. They were just presented with an exciting new offer to be on the ground floor of this opportunity to get preferential access to federal funding. And so it would be a little bit unfair to compare them to a place like Columbia, but I'll do it anyway. Columbia had their federal research funding frozen, and then they...
Hundreds of millions of dollars, right?
Yes, hundreds of millions of dollars. And they made a deal with the Trump administration and did sign on to several unprecedented provisions that really made everybody in higher ed sit up and take note. This included stuff like allowing some outside person to monitor their hiring and admissions practices. It included a $221 million payment. So I think it is fair to say that Columbia probably fails the Obama test, but they were in a tough spot. They had a terrible time during the encampment protests in 2024. A president resigned, then the interim president resigned. And so their backs were really against the wall. In the end, they agreed to a lot of things that many people saw as very intrusive, but there was a lot of money at stake.
Right. Part of the Obama formula is you have to be experiencing some pain in the way of freezing of federal funds in order to sort of show your backbone in these moments. Certainly Harvard is facing that. This is an interesting case when you think about the Obama standard for leadership. As we know, the Trump administration froze, a couple $2 billion in grants to Harvard as part of its negotiations with the institution. A lot of this has been justified as the Trump administration's concerns about anti-Semitism on college campuses. They want colleges to meet all sorts of different standards around that in order to have their funding restored. Harvard famously sued the Trump administration back in April over its research money being stripped. And that lawsuit has set up a real battle royale of higher ed's most storied institution versus the president of the United States in this very high-stakes standoff. Harvard had a big win in September with a ruling by a federal judge that said the administration had acted illegally when it froze those grants. And the Harvard Crimson reported this week that most of the university's federal funding has been restored. That's probably thanks in part or large part to this judge's ruling. But if this whole thing ends, Andy, with a deal or a compromise, as most people think it probably will, I feel like you're very likely to see Trump declare victory on Truth Social, no matter what the outcome. There will be a statement that the Trump administration has in some ways prevailed, and I'm curious how Harvard might respond to that. Alan Garber, Harvard's president, has put out some statements since the university sued the Trump administration. But in my experience, college leaders, even at Harvard, tend to be risk averse. And I'm just not sure that Alan Garber is going to go out on a victory tour and talk about all of the values that were preserved in whatever settlement is created. What do you think of that?
Well, in a hypothetical scenario like that, I think we're talking about Harvard striking a middle ground between the examples we just went over of Columbia and of MIT, right? And the hard truth here is that these considerations are very complicated, and sometimes it's not going to come down to something as simple as, did you preserve your academic independence or did you not? College presidents are wading through a lot of gray area. But Jack, before we go forward, I wanted to rewind and ask you something. I mean, we're talking about whether or not colleges are satisfying a prescription being made by Barack Obama, the former president. Why does he matter here? Do you think his figure carries some special significance?
I do, Andy. I think he does. I wrote a big piece in 2016 about Obama's approach to higher education, talked to people in the White House and Ed Department who had worked on various higher ed initiatives with Obama. And I think where you have to start is going back even to his early campaigns and the idea that the academy really viewed Barack Obama as one of us. He had taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago. He really leaned into that professorial image of a thoughtful, rational, educated decision maker. Interestingly, the label professor was kind of used as a slur against him by conservatives. I remember Sarah Palin making some jokes about it. It was a way of portraying him as out of touch and elite. Interestingly, Andy, I wrote a story about that years ago, and one of the people with whom I spoke thought that there was a racial undertone to that attack. The idea that the professor is sort of uppity, which is, an old racist trope. And I was surprised to hear that this got picked up by none other than Rush Limbaugh, who spent, 15 minutes talking about this Inside Higher Ed story I'd written about whether the term professor was racist. He had a lot of fun with that story. In any case, Obama did, once he got in office, he had this credibility with the academy, but I think he surprised a lot of people in higher education with the degree to which he was a little bit of a skeptic and even a hawk on higher education. You will remember that he put forward this college ratings plan, which would have tied federal aid to performance indicators like graduation rates. It ended up being something he kind of had to settle on. They ended up with the college scorecard, which we still have, and that included things like post-college earnings. But he really wanted to combine a spirit of accountability with this underlying idea that higher education was, in the end, a good thing for the country. So I would call him sort of a skeptic and a champion of the sector. But he's still seen as someone who embodies the intellectualism of the academy, the sort of sober thinking, those values. So I think it is meaningful that he's the one sending these messages to college presidents, which is effectively toughen up. This is the time to stake out some values and not to cower.
Well, I think first and foremost, he's a good reader of the national mood. That has been a constant in his career in the public eye. The thing that I think of is that back in 2015, he was excoriating college students for participating in cancel culture and for not adhering to the bedrock value of free speech. And this is 2015. He was well ahead of the curve on that, sort of making those statements before it was fashionable to do so, particularly from the left. That's significant. I mean, I think his biggest transformation in reading the national mood is that, he began his presidency very much in a spirit of college for all. Jack, you will remember that free community college was a big initiative. It was splashy. And then at the DNC just last year, he was out here saying that college cannot be the only path to middle-class success. It cannot be the only path to career success. And that is a huge shift in rhetoric, and it reflects a change in the national mood. And after that, post-2024, he has used his platform to try to urge colleges not to compromise their independence. And I think you can view that as, well, this is a former academic. It's a guy who knows colleges. It's a guy who wants to protect civil society. But you can also view it as, I believe that he sees out there a desire among a large swath of America for these civic institutions to stand up and fight against what he and others view as an authoritarian incursion.
Stick around. We'll be back in a minute. One of the top reasons students drop out of college is money. It's not just academics, it's financial stress. Intuit for Education provides free personal and professional financial education programs to schools with real-world tools designed to make an impact. Students can learn to manage expenses, learn about credit, navigate financial aid, and much more. It's a no-cost way for your institution to bolster retention and advance your mission in solidifying student success from their first year to their first job and beyond. Learn more at intuit.com/highered. Every time we hear from Obama, I think Democrats start to have a new conversation about who's going to be our next Obama, who will take up the mantle of the party. And I've been thinking about this in terms of higher education itself. I think that we are hearing more than ever a hunger for a white knight to emerge on behalf of higher education. And I've been looking through my college president trading cards, Andy, and trying to figure out, who is this person? And I'm not sure they're out there. I'm curious what you think. Are there contenders for this role?
Well, Jack, I've been meaning to ask you. I would love to trade my Michael Crow card for your Gregory Washington card. I don't know if you are interested.
That Washington card's going to be valuable because he's really been through a lot lately.
We'll have to see. We'll have to see what it looks like in 10 years. But, it's a fascinating question, Jack. It's one I've been contemplating a lot lately. And you don't have to look far from D.C. to find some examples of college presidents who are approaching the challenge of the Obama test differently. Speaking of Gregory Washington, he's one, George Mason University president, who has stood fast against the Trump administration's criticisms of particularly diversity hiring at George Mason. He has been very public in resisting these charges, resisting calls for him to step aside. Meanwhile, we travel not too far away to Charlottesville and find that Jim Ryan, president of the University of Virginia, resigned earlier this year after it was reported that the Trump administration had sought his resignation specifically to settle an ongoing dispute with the university. And he made a really interesting statement when he stepped aside, which is he said, to make a long story short, I'm inclined to fight for what I believe in, and I believe deeply in this university, but I cannot make a unilateral decision to fight the federal government in order to save my own job. So he's setting up a different formulation there, which he was sort of saying it would be selfish for me to fight this because I would just be trying to save my own job.
I think we have to pause on that, Andy, because I think that's the dilemma that the Obama standard creates, because Obama is creating sort of two options. You either tap your endowment, take a few lumps, be willing to sacrifice federal money, or you roll over. And Jim Ryan is saying, actually, the better path of leadership is for me to effectively roll over personally so that the University of Virginia doesn't have to, so that we don't take all of these hits, so that we don't lose all these jobs. How do you evaluate that as a leadership test, Andy? Because Obama's saying leadership isn't about saving a dollar. It's about saving your institution's soul. And Jim Ryan is saying, yeah, but if I keep my job and everyone here loses their job, what kind of leader am I? It's quite a quandary.
It's a real quandary. And this is the problem of collective action, Jack. In this scenario in which Jim Ryan decides to fight and UVA stands up, and UVA takes some funding cuts, it tries to endeavor to utilize its endowment to plug some gaps. Would other institutions stand up and say, yeah, we're going to do the same thing? We don't know. We don't know if college presidents are prepared to take a stand when they see an example like this, because nothing like this has ever happened before. And college presidents are much more inclined to safeguard the interests of their institution. That's what they're trained to do.
Yeah, I'm thinking back on Obama and all the trouble he had getting through the college ratings plan. And, one wonders what would have happened if he'd said, well, I'm just going to take hundreds of millions of dollars from you colleges and see how much you like it. Those were not the tactics the Obama administration used. And in fact, they settled for a lot less than they wanted in that regard.
Exactly.
Something Obama stressed in this conversation with Marc Maron was the idea that this really isn't that hard. He said, we're not asking you to be Nelson Mandela. We're asking you to sort of white knuckle it through what sounds like he thinks is a temporary situation, which some college leaders may disagree, but Harvard's endowment is over $50 billion. Columbia's is a lot less. I mean, it's still $15 billion. That's, sooner or later, we're talking about real money. That's according to the latest NACUBO Common Fund study. But tapping endowments isn't simple. Most colleges don't have anywhere near the amount of money that Harvard and Columbia have. The median is about $240 million. So this is a very difficult fight for all but the most highly selective, wealthy institutions. But I've been thinking about the presidents who might step into the void here. I spoke recently with Chris Eisgruber, the president at Princeton, and he has described Trump's attacks on Columbia as the greatest threat to American universities since the Red Scare of the 1950s. He wrote that in a piece in The Atlantic that was much talked about. He's pushing back against what he sees as misleading narratives about higher ed, particularly around free speech. He thinks higher ed does a pretty good job on free speech, but he's seen as having less to lose than some of the other Ivies. Princeton doesn't have a med school. It doesn't have the level of NIH funding that some of these other institutions have. He said that his board supports him speaking up. So he seems to be in a little bit different position than some of these people. I've also wondered about Michael Crow, Andy. I mean, obviously, this is one of the biggest names, certainly in public higher education, the president of Arizona State University. And I've been really watching what Crow might say around this. And to my knowledge, he has not come out really swinging. When I look at the things that Michael Crow is saying publicly that feel like coded messages to me, he's making the case that academia is, as he describes it, the invisible hand behind big inventions like the iPhone or the Tesla vehicle, this type of thing. He's basically saying, you don't know how many hundreds of patents sort of underlie this technology. And he's making that old school case that higher education needs to tell its story better. He's written a piece for the Wall Street Journal about foreign students making America great. These all seem like they are ways of positioning higher education as imperative to the future of the country, but he seems to be stopping short of any kind of overt attack against federal interventionism.
And there was some polling at one point that found that this research message was pretty popular among the public of universities play a key role in fueling scientific innovation. So it's no accident that when we see predominant messaging coming from higher ed, we often see it as the societal impact of great research, right? And that's an age-old case. One point I wanted to make, Jack, was I wanted to step back and ask a question that I will then answer. And the question is...
Well, we've been looking for a new host, Andy, so go to it. See if you can do both.
Hand the mic to me, Jack. Why are we asking these things of colleges when we're not asking the same things of other leaders in civil society, right? Do we ask the same questions about sacrifice to CEOs or leaders of big law firms, right? Both sectors of society that have also been pressured to strike deals with Trump, and some of whom have struck deals with Trump under similar...
I think the heads of these law firms have caught some flack.
I think it's an interesting standard to assess in different cases. And before we get too sympathetic to the plights of college presidents, I think it's important to underline that these institutions that we cover are not corporations. They're not law firms. I mean, when you become an academic, you devote yourself to truth, to the creation and dissemination of knowledge, right? With that comes a moral responsibility and ethical duty toward truth and toward other virtues and principles. And so this is the invisible duty of the college president, right? 364 days out of the year, they're trying to figure out how to safeguard the best interests of the university they lead long term. And then the one day they might have to make a huge decision about whether the university is going to stay true to its values. And so I think it's important to draw that distinction between college presidents and other leaders in civil society.
So yeah, I think the expectations that we have for a private corporation are certainly different than those we have for a university. Another person who's really been out there that we probably should mention is Michael Roth. He's the president of Wesleyan University. He's been among the most outspoken people against Trump during this administration and even before. I will say, as respected as Wesleyan is, it's a small liberal arts campus. It is not a household name or a reputational heavyweight in the way that some of these Ivies we've been talking about are. So I don't know how much that voice resonates. Ted Mitchell is another one, the president of the American Council on Education. He's certainly been out there throwing blows. He's an association leader, though. That feels a little different to me in terms of risk level than a sitting president who's answering to a lot of different constituencies, but certainly one to watch.
Absolutely. And as we look around for potential leaders, potential defenders, Jack, I think it's important also to make the point that, to me, higher education is more like the National Football League than it is like a state or a city or a county, right, that has political leadership. You don't look at the National Football League and say, well, who's the leader, right? This is a organization that consists of, micro units that compete against each other. And that's the reality here, is that colleges do compete for students. They compete for research funding, and they compete more broadly for prestige. One important aspect of American higher education is it is set up as a diffuse competitive model. And going back to the compact, the Trump administration seems to be trying to use that spirit of competition against the sector. And I think we're still waiting to see if that's going to work.
And what I'm wondering, too, with this news that potentially the compact might be offered more broadly across higher education is whether we're going to create more teams. Team Trump and Team Not Trump. We've seen this with things like the Chicago Principles, which are a free speech sort of doctrine that's been adopted by many universities. And by saying we adopt this, you're sort of signaling that we're not woke, we're not going to shield our students from scary ideas and this type of thing. I'm wondering if the Trump Compact might become something like that. What are you looking for going forward, Andy?
I'll be fascinated to see if any colleges come out and say, yeah, we're on board with the compact, because then there are 1,000 questions we need to ask about the implications of that, both in terms of the example it sets, but also, are they going to abide by the very intrusive provisions of this document? Or, as you alluded to, is it going to become a little patch that you can put on your jacket, if you're a college, to signify what you stand for and what kind of students you want to attract and what you want your reputation to be? It's too early for us to know the answer, but we're going to find out soon.
Yeah, well, we'll find out if the Trump Compact will become the new MAGA hat of higher education. We'll keep watching that. Andy, thanks so much for talking to me about this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jack. It was a pleasure.
College Matters from the Chronicle is a production of the Chronicle of Higher Education, the nation's leading independent newsroom covering colleges. If you like the show, please leave us a review or invite a friend to listen. And remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. You can find an archive of every episode, all of our show notes, and much more at chronicle.com/College Matters. If you like, drop us a note at collegematters@chronicle.com. We are produced by Rococo Punch. Our Chronicle producer is Fernanda Zamudio Suarez. Our podcast artwork is by Cottrell Thomas. Special thanks to our colleagues Brock Reed, Sarah Brown, Carmen Mendoza, Ron Coddington, Joshua Hatch, and all of the people at the Chronicle who make this show possible. I'm Jack Stripling. Thanks for listening. It's a fact. 70% of students claim they experience financial stress after arriving on campus. Intuit for Education offers free personal and professional financial education with real-world tools that empower students to achieve long-term success. Learn more at intuit.com/highered.